Greetings, friends. My name's Elias Sacks. I'm the director of the Jewish Publication Society, and I'm joined today by Dr. Benjamin Sommer, professor of Bible and Ancient Semitic Languages at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and Dr. A.J. Berkovitz, assistant professor of Ancient Judaism at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion. And our topic today is JPS's newest Bible commentary series, our 5-volume commentary on the Book of Psalms, for which Dr. Sommer serves as the series editor and for which Dr. Berkovitz plays a role, about which I will say more shortly. The first volume, that you see here, covering Psalms 120 to 150, came out this summer. The author was Dr. Adele Berlin, Robert H. Smith Professor of Bible Studies Emerita at the University of Maryland. The remaining volumes will be coming out over the coming years. And later this winter, I'll join Dr. Sommer for a conversation about the series as a whole. But today we're here to think about something that this series does that no other JPS Bible commentaries have done in the same depth. Let's dive into the liturgical and ritual uses of biblical texts in Jewish communities across the globe, across denominations, and across history. So Professor Sommer, Professor Berkovitz, thank you for taking the time to speak and think together today.
Thanks for having us. It's really exciting.
Delighted to be here.
Well, I'm looking forward to our conversation. So, I'll kick things off now, kind of maybe in general terms. So on the JPS website, we state that this series offers commentary on the Book of Psalms based on the most recent research on the language of the Bible, its literary forms, and the historical context that may have given rise to the Psalms. Paying in particular special attention to the message of each Psalm and to how the poetry shapes that message. So just to make sure that we're kind of all on the same page here, can you provide a brief introduction to the Book of Psalms? What are Psalms? What distinguishes them from other types of poetry? And where do the poems in the biblical book called Psalms come from?
So a psalm in the Bible is, I would say, a prayer in poetic form. And the Book of Psalms is an anthology, a collection of ancient Israelite prayers that are poetic in nature. You can imagine a character in the Bible sometimes speaking a prayer that is not a poem. That happens on a number of occasions. Hannah, for example, in 1 Samuel chapter 1. There are bunches of other cases of that as well. But the Book of Psalms are longer prayers than just a quick one-sentence request, which we get here and there in the Bible, and more specifically, they're poetry. While the most well-known Jewish and Christian tradition found already in the Bible itself attributes the Psalms, or most of the Psalms, to King David. That is, there's the idea that King David composed these. We modern Bible scholars, both Christian and Jewish, believe that the Psalms were actually written by a wide variety of ancient sages, especially Levites, many of whom worked in the temple and probably sang these Psalms in the temple in Jerusalem. Maybe also some of the Psalms come from other temples that existed in the land of Israel before worship was centralized at one temple in Jerusalem. So the Psalms were written by a wide variety of Israelite sages and Levites. I would add, though, that I think a lot of the Psalms probably weren't just written by one particular poet who sat down the way that a modern poet might, compose a poem, work on it a bit, and then send it off to the Atlantic Monthly or what have you. A lot of the Psalms were probably written and evolved over time by a whole community, or by a community of Levites, a community of sages. A lot of the Psalms use standardized language or formulaic language. A lot of them have similar structures, or at least formulaic elements that can be manipulated in one way or another. And given that that's the case, it's possible that there's no one author of a psalm, but rather that a group of different worshipers in ancient Israel over a few generations maybe came up with a new prayer, then over a few generations modified the prayer, changed the prayer, and there's really no one person we could say is the author of this particular psalm or that particular psalm. AJ, would you add anything to my definition or disagree somewhere?
No, I think that's an excellent definition. It's certainly a great one to begin with. I would just quibble and mention that, first of all, Psalms are old school viral, right? That's kind of why there's a long-standing tradition, which maybe we'll cover in the course of our conversation, to read the entire book from beginning to end, weekly, monthly, over the course of the entire year. And while that's an amazing custom, anyone who does so seriatim will find that they are not reading narrative. They're one poem does not actually lead to the next in most cases. They're discrete entities, and they kind of sound really, 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 really similar. And for the reasons that Ben mentioned, right? These are not the works of one particular author. They're viral. They're adaptable. They change, which is actually partly why you find not just formulas, but entire psalms. 14 and 53 are noted examples. It's basically the exact same psalm, except in the earlier version, you use the tetragrammaton, and the later version, it's the name Elohim, with a few minor quibbles. But the book is truly an anthology in that it really does contain multitudes. The other minor quibble that I have is, yes, I think the Levites were absolutely important in formulating and certainly transmitting this book across generations, but I would push further on sort of the popular folk elements of the Psalms. For example, we know from the ancient Near East and from ancient Israelite culture, women were lamenters, the Yulelot. It strikes me that while I can't point to any specific individual psalm and say a woman probably wrote this or transmitted this, to deny the entire genre of lament, the possibility that women were part of the process of transmitting the psalm seems, and just focus on the Levites seems to preclude an important dimension of transmission. So I agree with Ben entirely, and I want to push it further.
Yeah. Oh, actually, I wouldn't disagree there. I mean, there are a few stray references in the Bible to Nashim Hatzovot, to women who serve in the temple. And we can't be sure precisely what that refers to or what these women did, but the term tzovot, it seems to refer to somebody with some sort of specific job. And the idea that some of the Psalms could have come from those circles as well, I think is quite entirely plausible. Uh, Maybe just flesh out a little bit what I mean by kind of Psalms not necessarily having an author and emerging over generations. If I could just like suggest a comparison or an analogy, I think, let's say, very often in music, there are works of music that don't have a particular author, like in folk music, for example, not folk music that was composed in the 1960s, by Bob Dylan, let's say, but real folk music that comes from the folk, where there's no one author that's known, and there probably wasn't any one author. Or another example would be, let's say, blues. Blues has a particular format. If you ask a musician who knows what he's doing, who knows what she's doing, and if you just tell them, okay, this next number, it's going to be 12-bar blues, in B flat, up tempo, they immediately know what to do. There's a certain structure. They know how to handle that structure. And so sometimes when you're talking about a blues song, there's no one author. I mean, the chord structure of a blues song comes from a tradition. It goes back generations. Even if we're talking about a specific blues song, let's say if we're talking about Crossroads, Eric Clapton covered the original Crossroads by Robert Johnston, but his version was really an entirely new version. And then other people do a riff on the Clapton version. And even the original composition by Robert Johnston was using elements that came from African American culture in the American South that he was drawing on as a part of that culture. Often in blues, there are many different authors who contribute to something, many different composers and performers who contribute to what we're hearing. And some of the earliest ones will never be able to know what their names were. The Psalms are similar. They're a performance. So there were probably performers in the ancient temples in Jerusalem and elsewhere who, as they received these from their forebears, might have been adding in variations, may have been performing it their own way. Somebody else picked up on that way of performing it, and it became part of the psalm. So the wording of the Psalms, it's not just by one poet. It's coming really from whole groups of Israelites, of Judeans, of sages, Levites, males, perhaps also females, including females who served in an official capacity at the temple.
And to underscore that point, right, the textual tradition of the Book of Psalms itself talks or mentions numerous times this shir chadash or shira chadasha, and the call to construct and compose new psalms. In fact, psalms is obviously a Greek word, which actually has a more limited definition of a song of praise, comes from the Greek salos, which is to praise. But if you sort of take a look at what that translates in the Hebrew, it translates a variety of words: shir, zemer, a whole bunch of other terms that just deal with musicality. It's partly why I like to imagine the Book of Psalms as the anthology that went viral.
So I'm going to acknowledge first that I think this is the first time in these JPS conversations with authors where Eric Clapton has come up. Um, I'm not sure it's the first time Bob Dylan has come up, but I'm pretty sure it's the first time Eric Clapton has come up. But one of the other distinctions that also just came up is the distinction between kind of the Psalms in their original historical context and the Psalms as they have been used and continue to be used in communities throughout history. And this is an important distinction for any commentary, but in particular for this Psalm series. So on the one hand, in keeping with kind of all of our previous JPS Bible commentaries, kind of the primary focus of these Psalms commentaries is on what these poems meant in their original ancient historical context. As Professor Berlin puts it, on what contemporary scholars think the Psalms meant to the ancient community for whom they were written. On the other hand, for the first time, this series also includes something else. What you have termed sidebars on ritual and liturgical uses, discussions of the ways in which each psalm has been used in prayer and in ritual over the past 2 millennia in Rabbinic Judaism. For this first volume that just came out, Professor Sommer wrote these with Professor Avigdor Shinan. Professor Berkovitz will be taking these on for the rest of the series, also provided crucial input into the sidebars for the first volume. Could you say a little bit more? What are these sidebars? Can you give us some examples of ways in which Psalms have been used in prayer and in ritual? And maybe can you give us an example of what a sidebar discussing those uses covers?
So the sidebars are discussing the ways Psalms have been used in Rabbinic Judaism, both in prayer and also in certain ritual contexts. And that can mean a bunch of different things. First of all, when I say in Rabbinic Judaism, I'm talking about the way the Psalms have been used, really, especially over the past roughly 1,500, 1,800 years or so. They're not talking about the ways the Psalms were used in ancient Israel, but Professor Berlin discusses that. The actual commentators for all 5 volumes will discuss that. But these sidebars are discussing the ways that they've been used in the rabbinic tradition that starts with the Mishnah, the Talmuds, and comes out of the Talmuds. So that includes the way that Psalms show up and where Psalms show up and when Psalms show up in the Siddur, in the traditional Jewish prayer book. But part of what we're doing with these sidebars is we're not just looking at any one type of prayer book. We're not just looking at, let's say, an Ashkenazic prayer book. We're not just looking at a conservative or a reform, reconstructionist or Orthodox prayer book. We spread the net pretty wide. So we're looking at several different liturgical traditions within Judaism: Ashkenazic, Sephardic, Italian, Hasidic, and Yemenite, to be particular. We're looking at the ways and the places that Psalms show up in specific service, the morning service, the Friday evening service, and so forth. We're also looking, though, at ways that individuals or small groups of people in Jewish history have used the Psalms, how groups of people might get together to say Psalms. I mean, right at the moment, in my synagogue, I'm sure this is happening in a number of other synagogues, maybe in yours, AJ's, or in yours, Eli's. Psalms are being recited in my congregation so that each day all 150 Psalms are being recited on behalf of the people who have been injured, the people who have been killed, the people who are defending themselves in the land of Israel. That sort of use of Psalms, which is a temporary use in a specific situation, we talk about those sort of uses. We talk about specific uses that were particular to women in certain situations, in certain places and times. So we're talking about a bunch of different rituals and liturgical or prayer-based, synagogue-based uses of Psalms. We'll get into a few more specifically as we keep on going, but at least that'll give a sense of what we're talking about in these sidebars.
Just to give people an example kind of concretely of what these sidebars look like, I'm going to show on our screen now. This is a page from the commentary from Psalm 122. So for those of you just seeing a JPS Bible commentary for the first time, on the top there you see the Hebrew text from the actual Bible and the JPS English translation. Below you see the standard kind of commentary we have in all of our commentaries, where the authors, in this case Professor Berlin, goes through each verse, often each word, each phrase, and gives an explanation of what those words meant in their original historical context, historical background, a discussion of translation choices. And then at the bottom, we have a sidebar on ritual and liturgical uses that goes through some of the different kinds of uses that were just outlined. So there's a discussion of diverse uses of these psalms in different kinds of communities across the world. There's a discussion of the use of these psalms in different denominations in contemporary Judaism. And there's a discussion of some of those other kinds of ritual uses. In this case, the use of these psalms in magical contexts. We'll hear more about that shortly. This is a fairly short sidebar. There are also longer ones, again, depending on the different ways in which each psalm has or has not been used historically. I'm wondering if you could maybe add something, when did psalms come to be used liturgically and ritually? When do we start to see this as part of the rabbinic Jewish tradition, at least?
Right. So it's good you clarify there, because on the one hand, as Ben, and I'm sure as Adele and others will attest to quite well, many of these psalms, if not all of them, at some point were themselves liturgical, right? Whether that means prayer in a communal context or prayer in a personal context, right? The question is, when did these ritual readings become part of the sort of standard rabbinic prayer service and cycle? And the answer is really slowly over time, as most things in history. The assumption that we need to sort of push against is actually pretty common, namely that there was a temple in which these psalms, or some of these psalms, were sung, and the moment that temple is destroyed in 70 CE, the rabbis, or the early creators of foundations of rabbinic Judaism, ported the temple's liturgy to the synagogue and said, "Aha! Look, a little temple." It's sort of the party line, but it's actually kind of incorrect. The earliest rabbinic liturgy doesn't really feature much psalmody at all, except for two notable exceptions. And that's Hallel, right? The Psalms 113 to 118, and a fast day liturgy, which consists of numerous psalms. I'm forgetting their exact numbers: 120, 123, 130, and another. And these two seem to have been staples that do get ported to the Tannaitic period, right? That early period of rabbinic history that spans from 70 to 200. What they share in common is that they're non-temple. Both of these rituals were actually communal rituals that get carried over as the thing that centers the community, or is imagined to center the community. The temple ceases to exist. Hallel is fundamentally part of the earliest Passover Sidarim. And the fast day liturgy is quite literally happening Berchov Ha'ir, in the streets of the city. In fact, that fast day liturgy ritual has very numerous modern resonances, which you'll see if in the sidebars. Most of them are used today, and by today I mean quite literally today, after synagogue services, as a way to beseech God for mercy and aid during times of distress. So the thing, Mimamakim Karaticha Adonai, from the depths I call out to you, O Lord, and Asa Enai El Harim Me'ayin Yavo Ezri, I lift my eyes up to the mountain, from whence come my help. So these two sort of communal psalm rituals belong to sort of the earliest layers of rabbinic Judaism, but it isn't until the Amoraic period, 200 to 400 or 600, that you start to see trickles of Psalms and psalmody enter into daily liturgy. So Psalm 145 as the Ashrei, which is in the current volume, go read, becomes part of daily rabbinic liturgy, verses from two Psalms, 51 and 19, bracket the Amidah. And by the time you get to the Gaonic period, circa 900, I'm being a little flexible with dates here, when we have the first official Siddur, right? The first time someone actually is asked, what do we pray? This is Amram Gaoni. And he actually pens an entire prayer book as a response. It's only there when we really, truly see there's the preponderance of Psalms. And from there, it just continues to grow, to develop in different communities in different ways. So that's sort of like the brief snapshot of that early history of when Psalms becomes liturgical.
So we're going to come back to that theme of different uses in different communities shortly. I'll also just add, for those of you watching it, you've now heard two references to Psalms being recited today, meaning quite literally today. We're recording this conversation on October 31st, 2023. So barely three weeks after the Hamas terrorist attacks in Israel, to give some context for why we're talking about the recitation of these Psalms in communities across the world. Again, we'll come back to different uses in different communities shortly. Right now, I'm sort of curious about how we ended up with this material in this particular volume. These kinds of sidebars are something quite new in the history of JPS Tanakh commentaries, in the history of JPS Bible commentaries. On the one level, the commentaries have always aspired to a kind of religious musicality, to a concern with the history of Jewish interpretations of biblical texts. At the same time, this sustained focus not just on interpretation, but on ritual and liturgical use, that's something new. Could you say a little bit more about what motivated you to include this material in this series? Why does this material matter for readers and communities today?
So, when JPS first approached me about editing the 5-volume set of this commentary series, and of course, JPS has previously done the 5 volumes of the Chumash. You can kind of see them right behind me. They've almost finished doing the 5 volumes of the Chamesh Megillot, and those had other editors. My own teacher, Michael Fishbane, his teacher, Nachum Sarna, were the editors of those sets. When JPS approached me to edit the 5 volumes on the Book of Psalms, I thought it would make sense to add something that would make this commentary a bit more obviously and specifically a Jewish commentary on the Book of Psalms. We modern Bible scholars, we're all, whether Jewish or Christian, for the most part, whether religious or not religious, we're all using the same set of methods to interpret the text from what we Jews call the Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament, but in academic context is often referred to as the Hebrew Bible. And so a commentary on a biblical book by a Jew or a non-Jew, they might end up looking quite similar. I thought that especially for Psalms, it might be nice to do something that marks this set of volumes as being really intended for the Jewish community. And I say especially for Psalms, precisely because Psalms are a type of biblical text that one doesn't only read or study, but especially that Jews really use. You might even say that the rest of the Bible is based on sort of the idea that God is somehow literally or more figuratively revealing something to us that in the rest of the Bible, God is speaking to us, maybe through an ancient tradition, but in the book of Psalms, the voice, the speaker, is always the Jewish people, that we're addressing God. And so the Psalms have been used over time in many, many ways. And I thought the idea of adding some sidebars to talk about the ways in which Jews in more recent forms of Judaism, that is, in Rabbinic Judaism since about the time of the Mishnah, how we've been using them, how we've taken these ancient texts and without changing the wording, made them our own, made them work for us and use them to express our own voice. I thought that would be something that was just a nice addition specifically to the JPS, the Jewish Publication Society's Bible Commentary series.
Just to build on Ben's point, in many ways, his vision here actually actualizes a feature of the Psalms themselves, right? Namely, to become viral, to become lived, and to become used. As Ben said, no one's changing the text of the Psalms, but at least in our period, except through translation. But the way that the text was used and refracted across history reveals dimensions of Jewish history, Jewish thought, Jewish culture, both in the ways that some Psalms retain old echoes of an ancient biblical past, or innovate new ones. Two beautiful examples, I think, are Psalm 24. But both of them are in the commentary that Ben will be penning. Psalm 24, which is this grand coronation hymn, even in crowning the king, even in ancient Israel, which perhaps to no surprise becomes a real central feature of Rosh Hashanah liturgy, right? When theologically and metaphorically one is crowning the king. So there, the tradition actually echoes an ancient, distant usage. Or on a counterpoise, another psalm that Ben will be working on is Psalm 29, which seems to be this, theophany of the storm god. Havu Adonai b'nei Elim, right? The heavens are bursting. Kol Adonai b'koach, Kol Adonai l'avotesh, right there. God is basically thundering across the Mediterranean and over ancient Israel. Now, that doesn't quite fit with most people's modern theologies of, God bursting from the clouds and striking down with thunder. But it's interesting to note that the psalm appeals to the sort of revelation language in Psalm 29 and becomes the standard psalm in most rites that accompanies the removal of the ark, the removal of the Torah scroll from the ark, which is the symbol of revelation and revelation itself. So you have these two examples of, by paying attention to the liturgical use of the Psalms, we not only understand the Psalm better, but I think we understand Judaism and the history of Judaism and Jewish culture better. So I am grateful to JPS for allowing these sidebars to grace the pages of the commentary.
Actually, I might add there also that AJ referred quickly to some uses of Psalms. Let's say Psalm 29, when we're taking the Torah out of the ark on a Saturday morning. Something else that the sidebars do, and this shows up for Psalm 24, for example, is the introduction to the sidebars includes some charts on when Psalms are associated with particular holidays. So, for example, in certain versions of Rosh Hashanah liturgy, Psalm 24 plays a prominent role. So we've got some charts that go into a lot of those different uses, some of which will be familiar to people, let's say, who attend synagogue regularly, but some of which won't be, because it turns out that Ashkenazim, Sephardim, Italian Jews, and Yemenite Jews actually have very different traditions of which Psalms are used when for the different holidays. And I think there's a certain richness that these charts kind of recover as we see some commonalities among these different communities for the holidays, but also some very, very interesting differences for the different holidays in terms of what psalm is associated with the holiday, and also when during the holiday liturgy those special psalms are recited.
Right, and to double down on that point, it's largely because I think what these sidebars show is that, I hate to say it, it should be obvious, but Judaism is not a monovocal tradition, right? And to some degree, the fact that the liturgy, at least with respect to Psalms, right, Psalms as part of liturgy, was not central or canonical in the rabbinic period, it actually allowed, well, everyone has an Amidah, right? Everyone has an 18 blessings. You're not going to change the text of that too much in the medieval period. Or in the modern period, unless you're a reform, and that there's a whole history there to be told. But that just wasn't true of the Psalms. which allows each community and each tradition to sort of express its own character, its own way of adding on to prayer, to relate ritual to text and then ritual and text to God. We'll never know the exact reason behind every choice. In fact, I think that the work that is being done in these commentaries is the prerequisite for such scholarship. So this is actually, in addition to a popular volume, which it's also a scholarly volume or a prelude to additional thoughts on the Book of Psalms. But I think it also teaches us about the pietistic use of Psalms, right? The willingness of various communities to engage with Psalms in defining and adding on to their ritual and liturgical life.
But picking up on precisely this theme of the Psalms as a window into Jewish communal life and the diversity of uses, one of the really striking features of this volume and of the sidebars is the way in which they highlight kind of the real global diversity of Jewish life. We get the uses of Psalms by communities tracing their origins to North Africa and the Middle East, to Northern and Eastern Europe, to Italy, to Yemen. We get the use of the Psalms in women's prayer books. We get the use of Psalms across a wide range of denominations in North America, in Israel, and elsewhere today. You said a little bit about how this diversity came about the way in which it's tied to the differently canonical status of the Psalms. Can you say a little bit more, about how we found ourselves with this state of affairs? How did it come to be the case that the Psalms are used in such different ways in these different contexts?
So, as mentioned, a little bit has to do with that lack of canonicity in the formative rabbinic period for the Psalms, and the other part of the story is piety, I think. The boundary between sort of formal mandated liturgy, right, the things you have to say, versus what I'm going to temporarily call piety now, namely the stuff that we add on to say, is actually pretty porous. It's porous even in the rabbinic period. Ashrei, as an example, which is clearly a feature of liturgy. It's Psalm 145 plus a few verses in the beginning that begin with the words Ashrei, Ashrei, various verses that have Ashrei. And in the Babylonian Talmud, the first time the unit's really mentioned, it's actually not called Ashrei, it's called Tehillah LeDavid, Psalm 145, and it says, or at least the manuscript editions of the Talmud say, anyone who says this psalm once a day, he'll be, a muftach lo shehu ben olam haba. It is secured for him that he will have a place and merit in the world to come. It's you don't use that language for, you say this 3 times a day, do it. It's pietistic language. It's called to, this is extra, do it. Over time, this is extra just becomes part of the liturgy. In fact, most of the material towards the end of prayer were once upon a time voluntary things that were said as part of prayer that got dragged into the liturgy. So that's sort of what I meant earlier by, a lot of these differences come down to sort of choices by individual communities at individual moments that get then slowly, like the rabbinic tradition itself, get canonized with use and then revised over time, which is the case for some prayer books, like the Sfarad Hasidic prayer book, which took the Ashkenazic prayer book and then, based on Kabbalistic principles, among other things, decided, okay, let's add this psalm here because it aligns with a particular Kabbalistic principle. Let's add this psalm here for a similar reason. So it's a fairly dynamic process. I hope that begins to answer your question, Eli, because it would take books and books and books to explain why for each and every psalm such difference exists.
No, that's really helpful and really fantastic. And maybe we can kind of take one particular example that, at least for me, was really striking in spending time with this commentary, and that's what you call the magical use of Psalms. Can you say a little bit more? What do you mean by that? What are the magical ways in which Psalms have been used? And Why did you decide to explore this particular issue among the many other topics that are covered in this commentary?
As you note, one of the features that we cover, that Avigdor Shinan and I cover in the sidebars, are the uses of psalms for magical purposes in medieval Judaism. There are a number of different traditions. Especially well known are those that were described by a book called Sefer Shimush Tehillim, which is basically a listing of psalms and then magical uses of psalms. For example, recite this particular psalm if you're having trouble getting pregnant. Recite this particular psalm if you're having conflicts with your neighbor. Say this psalm 7 times at night for such and such a purpose. And I have to admit that in some ways I was wondering about this. To me, a lot of these uses of the Psalms, which really are magical and just seem really quite out there, they're not part of what I could even imagine being my own religious practice. And I was kind of wondering, should this be there? But I think Avigdor, my colleague Avigdor, made the right decision by saying, yeah, we should be covering these, because whether we like it or not, this kind of a use of Psalms was a very, very big part of Jewish piety in the Middle Ages, and I think probably continues to be a part of Jewish piety today. There are these lists of what are also known as sigulot that we refer to occasionally, that also talk about what psalm to say magically for aid in whatever particular situation. And if you Google it, you can find lists of these that are still being used by Jews around the world today in our own world. And I think that something that early Jewish academic scholars, when Jews started doing academic scholarship about Judaism in the 19th century, and Judaism, which Eli, of course, you know a whole lot more about than I know, or probably than AJ knows, since that's part of your own academic specialization. But back when that started, a lot of scholars didn't want to talk about the embarrassing stuff, the stuff that makes us Jews look wacko or primitive. And I think that as scholars, we do need to include this information and to acknowledge that this weird stuff that I, for one, have a lot of trouble with, this too is part of our tradition, and we shouldn't be in denial about it.
So I'm going to double down and Ben and say that I don't actually think it's this weird stuff. I think one of the ingenious moves that Ben and Avigdor do is notice what the sidebars are called: liturgy and ritual, not liturgy, ritual, and this anomalous, amorphic, weird Harry Potter category called magic. Because what we're seeing in Shimush Tehillim and books like it, by the way, the book Shimush Tehillim literally translates as not the magical use of Psalms. It's just, here's a book on Shimush Tehillim, how you use Psalms. And some of them are strange, escaping villainy. But some are just self-help, right? Say this if you want to be humble, or if you want to praise God, like this is the right Psalm to use. In the medieval world, and certainly for certain people in modernity, these are not distinct categories that play off one another, the sort of religion versus magic, right? They're all expressions of ritual and piety. Indeed, I can name you another ritual that might appear magic, right? The 15th of a certain month, people gather a pomfrond with willows and myrtle and a citron, and then shake it in the hopes of rain, right? Religion? Magic? Or is that just totally the wrong binary? And I think we ought to accord the same respect to Shimush Tehillim and that sort of lived dimension of the Book of Psalms. And again, I hate to keep referencing today, but at the end of synagogue services, when people are reciting Psalms, one ought to wonder, what does that recitation do? Or for certain segments of the Jewish population, what do they think that recitation does? I'm sure that you'll have your hyper rationalists that say something like, we read this because this is just what we read, or we read this because it builds community and helps us find expression for our pain. But I can guarantee you that there is a large segment of the Jewish population today that reads these Psalms in this particular moment because by racking up the merit, or by citing, or by reading this particular psalm, they will shift some heavenly calculus that will save a soldier's life, or be be part of the accounting that ultimately brings peace to the region. So I think that adding these dimensions and thinking about these dimensions, the magic, or bluntly, ritual, when talking about the lived experience of Psalms is not just good, but essential.
Yeah, that's a helpful pushback, AJ. I think what you said is really important. And actually, I have to admit, even though I do regard some of these magical uses of Psalms or these ritual uses of Psalms that are supposed to change the world in some way, although I do regard that with some suspicion, on the other hand, I've got to say I'm doing it myself right now. At my synagogue, at JTS, all the prayer services are ending with usually Psalm 130 or 121. And for that matter, when I'm right over here, every morning if I'm on my own, standing right there, reciting the morning service. Right now, I'm ending it every day with Psalm 120 or 121. And I suppose if you ask me why am I doing that, especially here by myself, if I'm not in a synagogue, I'm saying Shacharit and Ma'ariv by myself. Why am I adding that psalm at the end? I could probably give a number of different answers. One of the interesting things about ritual and the meaning of ritual is that ritual tends to come first and the possible meanings come second. And different Jews might say the same prayer, but mean something different by it. But even the same Jew, even a single Jew, might be doing a ritual without always being 100% clear on why he or she is doing the ritual. But we're committed to the ritual. And I have to say, I mean, even as a professor of biblical studies and Jewish thought and ancient Semitic languages who analyzes this stuff, that's true of me as well. I'm not 100% sure what I think will result from my individual recitation of Psalms during this period of the Gaza war, or my communal recitation of those Psalms when I'm in synagogue at home here in Teaneck or at JTS. But what comes first is my commitment to being part of the Jewish people who are reciting these Psalms right now, and possible meanings. I think that those tend to come second, and that's something that comes out a little bit, I think, in the sidebars, especially when we talk about we talk not only about when a particular psalm is used, but occasionally we talk about, in fact, usually we try to take a stab at answering the question, why was this psalm chosen for that situation or for that time of year or for that particular service? And there we can often only speculate. And it's useful to remember that our speculations are only one possible answer. The people that are doing these are practicing these practices, they may have more than one answer for that question.
And I think part of what we're hearing here is, just the degree to which Psalms are texts that are deeply enmeshed and embedded in the lives of communities. And maybe we can conclude kind of with one final question on precisely that topic. How can individuals use this JPS commentary and these sidebars in their communities? What do you hope that people will take away from this series? And how would you like to see this material be integrated into and be part and parcel of and be shaped by and help shape the lives of synagogues, places of learning, and other sorts of institutions?
So I'll leave it to Ben to speak about the commentary proper. I'll limit myself to the sidebars, but I mean, kind of just as Ben said, right? These sidebars can be put and should be put to multiple uses. At its base, they're information, and they're wonderful information. One can read the sidebars and get a sense of just the broad diversity of the Jewish experience and of different Jewish communities. Many people probably, and this is a terrible assumption, are probably engaging with a version of the Ashkenazic Siddur. There are other communities out there that have different traditions and are saying entirely different psalms. So just to appreciate the vast scope and the diversity of what it means to be part of Judaism and the Jewish people, but also, as Ben had mentioned earlier, we do really try to attempt and give a stab at why these psalms are particularly chosen. I feel that a lot of people sort of, oh yeah, I shouldn't say this, daven the Psalms. No. You encounter the Psalms in your liturgical practice and you just and you mumble it and move on. I think the sidebars are particularly useful because I think it will help explain to communities and synagogues and other places of learning, okay, why are you doing this? What are what are some possible intended reasons for why these texts are the ones that you're saying. But ultimately, above and beyond, I think the sidebars are truly just an invitation to think psalmically, to appreciate history, to understand where psalms have been used, and to, I think, encourage future generations of Jews and contemporary Jews to just do exactly as their ancestors have done. Use psalms, make them meaningful, make them relevant.
So I wonder if I could build on something that AJ just said to add something to that answer. I think that modern American Jews have lost the Book of Psalms. It becomes evident from the sidebars, from the various charts that accompany the sidebars, that over the past 1,500 years or so, Psalms have been one of the most beloved parts of the Bible, one of the most used parts of the Bible. I think it's fair to say, in a way, maybe after the 5 books of Moses, one of the most important parts of the Bible for Jewish individuals, Jewish groups, and whole Jewish communities. But in the last, perhaps, I don't know, 100 years or so, I think that a lot of modern Jews have lost the Psalms, and I mean that in 2 different ways. One is something that AJ referred to, which is that among people who go to synagogue or who recite traditional Jewish liturgies regularly, Psalms are something that we mumble quickly, and people don't pay attention to the meaning, or the meanings, I should say, of the book of Psalms. And so, first of all, I think the commentaries themselves, starting with volume 5 with Adele's commentary, and then in the other 4 commentaries, I think that the commentaries explain the poetry of the Psalms, explain the different possible meanings, and sometimes the rich multiple meanings of verses in the Psalms, and explain how these might have been used in ancient Israel, which is suggestive for how modern Jews might use them today. And so for contemporary Jews, including Jews who say the Psalms real quickly, but might not pay attention to the wording, I think that the commentary will, I hope, help people slow down and realize what extraordinarily beautiful poetry we've got in the Psalms, what psychologically insightful observations about human nature and the problematic nature, the complex nature of human beings' relationship with God, we've got in the book of Psalms. I think that they explain how the relationship between a human being and God changes drastically over the course of time, over the course of a year, over the course of a person's life, over the course of just a few weeks, because we've got such different moods in the Psalms. I think the commentary does that. I think also that the sidebars, perhaps they can do something to remind Jews that you own the Psalms. These are things that these are texts that can play a role in your daily life, in your weekly life. There's a rich array of possibilities that are presented in the sidebars and in the accompanying charts. But there's a story that's told that Abraham Joshua Heschel, one of the greatest Jewish theologians of the 20th century, was speaking once at a synagogue. And afterwards, a person came up to him and said, you know, recently I went to church with my neighbor, with my non-Jewish neighbor, and I thought that the Psalms were so, so beautiful. Why doesn't Judaism have a book of Psalms? I think that there's an extent to which we've lost the book of Psalms, and people don't realize that this beautiful poetry is part of our own tradition. And if you're wondering how you might put these texts, these poems, into your own daily life, into your own practice, into your own weekly liturgy, the sidebars might contain some suggestions. And even if you're Ashkenazic, but you see something that's interesting from the Yemenite liturgy, you know, give it a try. I must say, actually, the Eastern Ashkenazic practice for Rosh Chodesh, for the new moon, is that we recite Psalm 104, which is actually a very, very long psalm. And I find if I'm in synagogue, there's never enough time to finish it. It always goes much too quickly. I was delighted in doing the research for these to find out that Italian Jews do Psalm 8, which, like Psalm 104, is an absolutely beautiful psalm, but it's much shorter. So I find that I've adopted the practice of saying Psalm 8 on Rosh Chodesh as a result of having put these charts together. And maybe other people will find that there's something that the Edot HaMizrach do that they want to adopt into their own practice. Or maybe just from the sheer variety of these practices, they'll decide that they just want to read through the entire book of Psalms and decide that there are a few that really work for them, And regardless of whether it was previously a Jewish practice, maybe they're going to make it into their own practice. And centuries from now, somebody will be doing a revision of this. And who knows, it might be the case that that practice has caught on and gets into the charts that are being done by JPS or whatever organization exists 500 years from now. So with that thought, I'll finish up. I don't know if that answers the question you were looking for, Eli, but I thought I would add that to what AJ said.
Absolutely, and I can't imagine a better advertisement for these commentaries than that they hold open the promise both of recovering texts that have been lost to us and of shortening liturgy sometimes in synagogue. I say that as someone who is married to a cantor. I want to thank both of you, Professor Sommer, Professor Berkovitz, for speaking with me today and for all that you have done to open up these texts and these poems to readers and communities across the globe. I, of course, also want to thank Professor Berlin for composing the first volume, the first chronologically, last in terms of the orders of the Psalms that came out this summer. For anyone who wants to get a copy of this volume, you can visit our website, jps.org. There will also be a link in the description of the video below, and we look forward to future conversations.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Lihitrot.